couple more people still joining us. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's just the afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation. So hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Doctor. I'm the Comprehensive and Neighborhood Planning Manager for the City of Flagstaff, and I'm going to introduce 4 of my colleagues today for this regional snapshot on flooding, fire, and emergency management. This is the first of a 2-part series in our regional snapshots. For those who haven't been on a regional snapshot before, this is something that we are doing almost every Monday. We're skipping some holidays. And you can register for this or any upcoming webinar at our regional plan website, regionalflagstaff.az.gov/regional plan 2045. The format today's meeting is to have a 15-minute presentation and 15 minutes of Q&A. All these videos post to the city's YouTube channel under a playlist, so you can find them all together. This and all other material presented during regional snapshots are draft. So they're basically what we know so far and the data we've been able to pull together. So if you have something new or interesting you want us to look at or add to the material that's provided in any of these presentations, please feel free to contact the project team through the website. Today we are doing the first of a 2-part series on flooding, fire, and emergency management. Today we're going to cover, and I will hand this off to Wes Dyson at the end of this slide, some basics on emergency management, information about how regional fire districts are organized and what is done for fire prevention in our region, the relationship of fire, watersheds, and flooding, and other risks that are considered in our emergency management planning as a community. At the next webinar, we will be looking more at the regional regulations that are pertinent to flooding and any future mitigation projects or conditions that we are working to prepare for with the staff at Stormwater and the Flood Control District. So with that, I will hand this conversation over to Wes, and then to Paul Ogletree, who's from the City of Flagstaff Fire Department.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you. So I appreciate the introduction. So I'll be very brief. What you see represented here really is kind of our guidance, if you will. FEMA has identified these 5 response areas. They do follow kind of a logical order. If you start with prevention up there just past, say, 12 o'clock, it follows a cycle that runs through preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. Now, I think probably the important points to bring out on this particular slide are a couple. Recovery, kind of an area that in the past has been long overlooked. You know, we're really good at the response part, the red lights and sirens phase, if you will. But the recovery piece sometimes gets a little bit of a short change. In fact, it is probably the longest phase involved here. It's bringing the area that was struck by a disaster or by a threat of some sort back to the new norm. It can take a long time. If there are federal declarations or state declarations involved, there's a lot of paperwork and long process. But it's really an important phase that I think sometimes gets overlooked a little bit. The other one that's important is mitigation. So there's really 2 categories of mitigation. There's emergency mitigation. That's the things that we take care of in the event, during the event, like during the recent flooding. Mitigation efforts to reduce the impact of the flooding. But then there's long-term mitigation projects where we're really going to do our best to try to fix those things. For example, do we need bigger culverts? Do we need more sediment ponds? Long-term projects that can be implemented. They're generally quite large, require some engineering, and take a long period of time, but they're designed to reduce the impact of disasters. In common FEMA speak, it is estimated that for every $1 that we spend in some type of mitigation effort, we save between $6 and $8 in emergency response or emergency mitigation. So mitigation is really, really important. Long-term projects, there's funding available through FEMA to support some of these long-term projects. And it is a competitive process, but there are significant funds out there to help us with that particular effort. Unless there's questions, Sarah, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. I'm going to pass it actually to Paul Ogletree from the City of Flagstaff Fire Department to talk a little bit about fire, which is the first risk event that we're going to talk about in this series.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. I'm Paul Oltrogge. I'm in the role of Wildland Fire Manager with the City of Flagstaff in the Summit Fire and Medical District. And Sarah, if we can just stay on slide 4 for just a second, I'm going to dovetail a little bit off what Wes is talking about. So within Wildland Fire Management, we follow the same 5 tenets. And what that means for us from a mitigation standpoint is really what we're talking about is landscape treating. And so that can mean fuels reduction and then typically prescribed fire. So we'll come in to reduce the amount of fuels, and then we will back that investment up with a longer term impact of prescribed fire. And then for prevention, we're going to implement some of the WUI codes that we have in place. And then we're going to do a lot of public education and outreach. And to kind of talk about what, the same concept that Wes was talking about in regards to the investment, for every dollar of investment, they save 6 to 8 in the long term. We're looking to do the same thing with prevention. So the more that we can prevent on the front end, the better off we're going to be in the long term. And then for preparedness, really for us, I think Wes's definition hits it right on the head. It's how to respond. And for us, that is conversations with partners about how to respond within the areas around Greater Flagstaff. Response can be year-round. It can be anything related to wildland fire response. And you see that kind of typically in areas like California now. They're hosting bigger fires, usually around the calendar. But for us, that means it's typically late spring into the monsoon season is when we're going to really default to more of our response mechanism. And that is full suppression of wildland fire. And then for the rest of the year, we're trying to plan, prepare, and mitigate. And for recovery, we use these first 4 in hopes to stay out of the recovery process. And that's usually longer term, some of the stuff Wes is talking about. And that can be anything ranging from economic impacts to long-term flood recovery, what we're talking about today. Next slide. And so when we talk about mitigation, what exactly are we trying to mitigate? And these 2 photos offer a great illustration of how some of our policies have changed the landscape over the last 100 years. If you look at the top picture, that is looking south and east from the north, kind of off that 151 road area, looking towards Fern Mountain. And that is by the Nature Conservancy and Camp Colton properties. And in the top photo, you can really make out kind of the profile and the ridgeline of Fern Mountain. And then you see along that bottom area, or that second photo, you can hardly make that out due to the encroachment of ponderosa pine and mixed conifer over 100 years. And that timeline matches up with a big change in policy. So as we began to settle the area, pre-settlement, it all looked like the top picture. Post-settlement, we started to come up with policies after big events like the Big Burn of 1910 in the Northwest. We came out with policies like the 10 a.m. rule, where full fire suppression was in effect and we no longer use it as a tool in the landscape. The resulting effect is overgrown forests and encroachments into things like the watershed and some of the more open space areas. Next slide. So this is another great illustration. This is Walker Lake, a little bit more of an extended timeline. I think there's about a 30-year difference between these 2 photos and the previous 2. But along that ridgeline, you see the same type of impact to the ponderosa pine, but something to really pay attention to here. And it's hard not knowing the seasonality of the photo, but Walker Lake itself, the water table is sucked a little more dry, right? So anytime you increase the load of ponderosa pine, that's another species that's going to need its own amount of the water resources. Something to really pay close attention to here is that grass component in the second photo, in the more recent photo from 2004. That's what we would call a grass fuel model. And typically when we're talking about fuel models of wildland fire, we talk about brush, timber, and grass, those 3 types to make it really simple. A continuous grass fuel model like this, where there are no natural breaks on the landscape, that's what's always going to carry fire. And so when you think about some of the bigger fires that have been in the Southwest over the last 2 or 3 years, like the Bush or the Sawtooth Fire down around Lake Roosevelt on the Tonto National Forest, they were sustained to burn tens of thousands of acres only in a grass fuel model component. Hardly any timber and just a little bit of brush. And so when we're talking, and we'll talk a little later about protecting homes and what actually carries fire, it's this grass component. We cannot remove the grass component with landscape treatments such as hand or mechanical thinning. The only way to treat this is with prescribed fire. And Sarah, next slide. So another really good set of images, and I'll kind of wait for them to load here. But if you start at that lower left, that photo from 1909, and then there's a person standing there next to that big yellow pine, and same for the next photo in 1948. Follow those 3 photos kind of on a vector to the upper right corner of the screen, and you'll see just how much that landscape got impacted with strategies like full fire suppression over about a 100-year timeline. And then what those other 2 photos show are really, we only have, to keep it simple, we have 2 options of how we can move fire through a fire adapted ecosystem such as the greater Flagstaff area. We can either do it low and slow, like the upper left-hand corner, and manage fire, or use prescribed fire as a tool to back up the initial investment of our landscape treatment. Or the lower right corner, we can host catastrophic wildfires, such as the Slide, the Schultz, the Raphael. Those are all examples of what we call big type 1 fires that have occurred around greater Flagstaff. Good indicator in these photos is the sustained crown fire. So that's when the crowns of those trees can carry fire on their own and give off those 200 to 300 foot flame lengths. So that's what we're obviously trying to avoid. That's what's going to have the greatest impact long-term to local economies, to watersheds, to resources, to what Wes was talking about the longer-term investment for recovery. That lower right photo shows what $8 of recovery looks like. Upper left would be more of that $1 of initial investment that Wes was talking about. Next slide. And so we put this image in here to kind of illustrate some of the partnerships that we have around greater Flagstaff. And when you're talking about large and small scale landscape treatments, those partnerships layer over each other and can be complex in nature, or as this illustrates, can be really, really good, almost on a handshake agreement. And so the image of the different districts shows some of the fire response areas around greater Flagstaff. So along the north there, working west to east, you have a lot of the Summit Fire District. Around the I-40, I-17 interchange, you see a lot of where Flag Fire's responsibility is. Moving south on the I-17, you have Highlands Fire District and then Pinewood Fire District. And then west and east along the I-40, we have Ponderosa, Camp Navajo, and some other outlying districts and agencies. Also shown in this picture is the Bearjaw Interagency Type 2 IA crew. That's a 20-person crew sponsored by Highlands Fire and Pinewood Fire. And they come with a robust set of skills. So mainly anything related to wildland fire operations, a unit like this can implement. So anything from suppression to fuels mitigation to prescribed fire, they do all that stuff. Flagstaff and Summit have a similar model. We have a crew with about half as many folks. We hold 10 of them. A little bit of a different mission, mainly landscape treatments for hand thinning around greater Flagstaff and a little bit of prescribed fire implementation. But really what we wanted to show here is we have this map divided into a number of different districts and jurisdictions, understanding that emergencies don't play by those rules. So it's really important for us to have a system in place, much like what we call automatic aid, where somebody calls 911. It doesn't matter where on this map there's an emergency occurring, partners are going to respond if another partner needs help. Great example of that is any kind of wildland fire around Flagstaff, there's always going to be multiple agencies on scene because it's likely impacting multiple jurisdictions or neighborhoods, anything from a small 1/10 of an acre fire all the way up to the Raphael fire. Next slide. And then, so when we're talking about really getting into prevention and some of the codes and some of that kind of stuff, this is a a great illustration that keeps it really simple. You can follow this continuum from wildlands to rural, all the way up to urban town centers, or in fire speak, wildlands to intermix to ember zone. And then in the top image, you see the wildlands and the intermix. So right where, you know, and you can think about some of the surrounding areas in Flagstaff where those wildlands begin to bump up into more of a rural community. And in that transition, you have a lot of those fuel components like that continuous grass fuel model that'll carry fire right into that intermix. And as you can see by the smoke columns, a lot more available fuel to burn. As you get into more of the interface and into more of the urban town centers, we're never going to be impacted in those areas by a flaming front. It's going to be more what we would call ember wash. So on hot, dry, windy days, a fire ember can sustain and be carried as far as up or exceeding 1 mile. So just think about what that kind of an impact would look like. And then all that ember would need is a receptacle fuel bed, to ignite. So if there's a fire outside of town and we have large sustained red flag winds and we get an ember carried 1 mile in, all it would need was an unclean gutter with dry pine needles to impact that kind of a structure. Next slide. And then finally, here's some, just a couple of examples of some of the larger scale landscape treatments that we have going. The Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, FWPP, and then of course, Forest Restoration Initiative, FORFRI. So again, those are larger scale. Those would be some of the partnerships we're talking about with federal and state agencies, and take much longer to implement and follow along the same kind of timelines and tenets though, right? So any kind of mechanical fitting that occurs here, we're going to want to make sure that we're backing that initial investment up with long-term forest restoration efforts. Thank you, Sarah. I think that's all I had, and I'm turning it over to Ed.
Thank you, Paul. So my name is Ed Schenk. I'm the Stormwater Manager here at the City of Flagstaff. Just going to go over a handful of slides here about flooding and flood emergencies, if you will. This past year was a fairly wet monsoon. We had 4 watersheds that experienced flooding. Spruce Wash, which drains the Museum Fire area, Fanning Wash, Rio de Flag, and several unnamed drainages within University Heights. Watershed disturbance can cause worse flooding. So usually we're talking about disturbance, that'd be like a catastrophic fire like Paul was talking about, those crown to crown fires that really can disturb the soil. However, flooding is possible in any watershed or any drainage, just depending upon the climate of the time. On the right here, you can see a graph or a figure. What we're looking at here in this particular figure is the watershed area on the x-axis, cross-sectional area, so the area of the watershed on the y. And you see these 2 lines, so the red line and that sort of bluish or black line. Those are regional curves for watersheds that we expect to see a certain type of channel. And then all those little dots that you see there, those are Flagstaff area streams. So those streams are mostly below those curves. And what that means is that we have really small channels for the watershed size that we have. And you get those small channels in areas that don't see a lot of flooding. This is the natural channels, not within the city, but the areas out in the forest. If they don't see a lot of flooding or a lot of flow, they're going to have a small channel for the size of the watershed. And what that means is when it rains, most of that rain is intercepted by the canopy, the ponderosa pine canopy, or it's soaked into the ground through the pine duff and through the organic layer. Now, it's kind of hard to see in this figure, but those kind of red dashes or red dots that are a little bit higher up on that graph, those are watersheds within burned areas within Flagstaff. Mostly those are from the Schultz fire in 2010. And as you can see, that's a little bit higher up on the graph. It's actually within those lines or even a little bit higher. So what that's showing within this graph is with fire or after fire, we start having flooding. With those floods, the channels grow. So they both in size downwards and they also erode laterally. So they erode outwards. So what this graph shows is really that we start with watersheds that are what we call complacent. They can take quite a bit of rain, and not much runoff comes from that rain. And then when you have large disturbance events like a Schultz fire or Raphael fire, for example, then we have what we're called violent watersheds. So a little bit of rain goes a long way. A little bit of rain can cause those catastrophic floods. So that's what we have to deal with here in Flagstaff and also Coconino County. There's two very different, if you want to call it almost bipolar watershed types. So complacent all the way to violent. Next slide. We have roughly 20 different watersheds or sub-watersheds in the Flagstaff area that drain mostly to the Little Colorado River to the northeast, and then a handful that also drain to the Verde River to the south, essentially, through Oak Creek. All the Flagstaff area streams are ephemeral or intermittent unless supplied by reclaimed water or unless they are spring-fed. And the spring-fed channels tend to be fairly short. I mean, we're talking way less than a mile, but the springs are the only natural perennial source in this area. Next slide. As I mentioned, the Rio de Flag is the dominant watershed through the Flagstaff area. It's highly urbanized in the middle reaches, as you expect, going through downtown and then exiting out near Picture Canyon. The flooding can occur due to urbanization, fire disturbance. If back in the day, and by back in the day, I mean about 100 years ago, some clear-cut areas within the Flagstaff area, or just climate. Sometimes we just have floods just because it rained a whole lot in a very short amount of time. So there's lots of different reasons for flooding in the area. Next slide. As I mentioned, there's lots of different reasons for flooding. There's two general times a year where we see flooding in Flagstaff. Most people really focus on the monsoon events in the summer, and we do get some large floods then. That picture on the right is actually from some of the spruce wash flooding that we saw this July. So we'll get those large events, but actually some of the largest floods we've had in at least this history of Flagstaff is rain on snow. So some of our largest flooding events are in the spring, usually February or March. So that picture on the left, that aerial imagery, that's of the Continental Country Club area, if you're familiar with that, near Campbell Mesa, and what we call Lake Continental. So that was from 1993, where we had a large flood, rain on snow in February. Next slide. And with that, I'll move you over to Wes. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon again. So, what we've been talking a lot about here is fire, which is, of course, as you'll see here, is number one on our list. One of the things we do here in emergency management is we work across the county, and we work under some guides from FEMA to develop what we call the Coconino County Multi-Jurisdictional Hazard Mitigation Plan. I left the word mitigation out there, apologize. We look at all of the threats and hazards that the county faces and all of our jurisdictions, and we rate them. There's a whole process that we go through. We look at probability, we look at magnitude, we look at warning time, and we look at duration, and they're all crunched into a formula called the Calculated Priority Risk Index, and they all come out with a score. These are the 10 hazards that we currently have in our county plan. Now, I will say, probably some people are going to see, well, there's other hazards that I think should be here, and there are other hazards. These are the 10 most prevalent, and one of the keys that we look at is the hazards that we can actually work to mitigate. Going back to the conversation that Paul brought up and things that we've talked about in terms of being able to hopefully work to prevent some of this stuff. Wildland fire, you've heard how we can prevent that. Flash flood, flooding, debris flows. We're currently working on different projects to help reduce some of those effects in the museum post-fire flooding zone. There are efforts we can actually undertake to do that. The new one we just added this year is public health outbreak. Everybody can probably guess why. We're looking at the COVID pandemic, and there are things, again, that we can do to try to mitigate those. And you look at some of the others there that list the top 10. Really, these are where we kind of focus our efforts in terms of what we look at for mitigation from FEMA. there are local hazards. I'll give you an example, Tucson, one of our local jurisdictions. They look at an airplane accident. They've got a big airport out there. They could take just about any size aircraft. So they look at that as a hazard. Certainly valid, absolutely for real, but it is not one that we consider in our top 10 for the entire county. No less valid, but definitely not one of our top 10 in terms of the efforts that we take. Generally, what we look for here are natural hazards, but you'll notice hazmat and pipeline failure is on there. Transportation accidents. We can take some steps and some efforts to prevent and mitigate those. Really, they are man-made. They are generally not preventable in terms of, if a train derails or if a truck overturns, we could potentially have a hazmat response. But really what we're looking at here is the key things that we look at in addition to wildfire, which is of course our biggest, most, as you'll see there, 4.0 severe threat. So we look at all these categories, try to make some long-term plans, back to the mitigation piece, long-term plans, and there's a lot of recovery that's involved in these. When you look at the number 2 bullet there, flash floods, everybody saw what happened in Flagstaff this year, in different parts of the city of Flagstaff. A lot of long-term fix and work is necessary to recover from those types of things. So really there's more to it. We try to take a holistic all hazards, which is the kind of the catchphrase that FEMA likes to see in here, all hazards approach to what we do in terms of planning and response. That's all I have, sir. I think that's back to you then.
Thank you, Paul, Wes, and Ed. We in the regional planning effort, I just want to build on something Wes said here. It really, all 5 phases of emergency management are part of our regional plan. We are working the community development staff at the city. We are working with the fire department on their station placement study. We discuss these land use decisions about response and recovery and mitigation at every development case that comes before the city. There's consideration given to all of these hazards, and we all work together on the multi-jurisdictional hazard plan. In terms of the snapshots, we have today where we're starting to talk about wildfire, next week where we're going to talk about flooding in particular, and then later in March, early April, we will have one on public health outbreaks and public health issues and mitigation as well. So if any of these other ones are ones that you're more curious about or you want to ask us questions about as well, that's something that all falls within our ability to discuss as part of this regional planning effort and to continue to improve our coordination on. And so I'm going to stop sharing and I'll ask if there are any questions. Just either raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat and I'll call on you and you can ask our esteemed colleagues any question that comes to mind in terms of what we just presented. I see Sat has a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask Sat?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. How does the recent federal infrastructure plan affect things? I've seen some things in the paper, but I'm not sure how it really hits us on the ground here in Flagstaff.
Would anybody like to take that one? I'm not sure who to direct that to. It's a pretty broad question. I see Paul and Jay have both turned their cameras on. So Paul and then Jay.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Sat. I'll let Jay will be able to speak to it a lot more intelligently than I will. But Sat, as far as our office goes within the fire department, it's a lot of tracking with the legislation, attending meetings in Phoenix, being part of Forefront FWPP. That's how we're setting ourselves up to receive some of those infrastructure dollars. But I think Jay will be able to articulate that quite a bit better than I can.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So what I can tell you is we know that the Forest Service has been allocated $54 million per year for the next 5 years through the infrastructure bill to go specifically toward forest restoration initiative projects. what they did then was they prioritized certain areas within that footprint that already had partnership dollars that had been invested or were looking to be invested. So that put like the work the county's been doing with Bill Williams Mountain on the list. It also put the C.C. Craig watershed on the list and the upper Rio area of the watershed on the list. So those are areas that are going to be prioritized. Then they're doing a rapid assessment to look at all the other areas to try to assess on the Coconino and the Kaibab National Forest, where should they put those dollars? I know $10 million has already been allocated for road work in the National Forest to try to help improve roads. And so there's a lot of things, moving parts going on, but we're going to get a very flush of money coming into the Coconino and the Kaibab and Apache Greaves and Tonto National Forest to do a lot of work to really get us hopefully moving forward on forest restoration to protect from the catastrophic wildfires and post-fire flooding.
Nat, I know you put a question in the chat, but do you want to ask your question by unmuting
Yeah.
instead? Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. What I put in the chat were more conversation pieces rather than questions. You may have read them, but first of all, wonderful presentations, wonderful pictures exemplifying what you're trying to cure. And I wish there could be some more discussions amongst the public, not like presentations to the public, but this type of webinar presentation where people could come to it and just discuss things. Anyways, it's kudos to you guys. Thanks a lot.
Hi, Nat. Before you hang up, just real quick, I think that's a great idea. I put my email in the chat. If you'd like to talk about that further, please reach out to me and we'll set something up.
Thank you.
You made a really interesting point too in the chat that I want to ask, and then I'll go back to Sat, who has another question. So one thing you said is, asked if we're looking at cumulatively how all the little mitigation projects we could be doing across the region might add up to a bigger project, and what's the cost benefit of those things. I know that maybe Ed and Greg might be able to jump in on that. What do you think about, there's big projects like FORFRY and the FWPP, which is the Forest Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, but there's also a ton of little projects that are unfunded and have been identified by staffs at both the city and the county. Would you like to speak to how we're looking at those and what they might mean cumulatively for the region?
Sarah, I can take a stab at it. It's going to be very different for stormwater or for flood control versus for forest management and fire. I'm guessing they're similar, but obviously we're two different groups. Within drainages, yeah, we usually have a drainage master plan or drainage master study. I'm not sure what the Coconino County's most recent is, but within the city, ours is fairly old. The last master study that we had was 2009, and that was for the northeast area of Flagstaff. We are conducting a new master plan, if you will, for the Spruce Wash watershed. That's both the county and the city, for the entirety of Spruce Wash, going into the lower part of the Rio de Flag. And that will do exactly what you're talking about, Sarah, where we can actually look at all these different projects. How do they stage? How do they work well together or not work well together? And what's the cumulative effect of those projects? But yeah, that's something I would assume the forest, or not Forest Service, but the forest projects are probably similar, where you have also an overarching plan.
Would anyone from the county like to speak a little to that question too, of how we are tracking the little projects and how they all add up? I see
I don't know if I
Jay
could say,
unmuting.
yeah, I don't know if I could say a whole lot about that. I mean, I know from the forest restoration side, we hired an intern this year to a GIS specialist to really help us build some of these kind of storylines that are a little bit more interactive through GIS and some mapping and stuff. And we're working on those. But as far as all the projects that we've been doing through museum flood and all that, I'm sure she's going to probably be working on some of that as well. So we're trying to build those to make it a little bit easier for people to understand how those pieces get all put together in the big picture. Because one of the other things we're looking at is we have a grant that will be doing some work in Munns Park and Kachina Village, trying to do some thinning within the communities. So all of those things, do tend to add up, just like you said. So yeah, it's just trying to find a way to get that information out to everybody.
Greg, do you have something you want to add?
I was just going to point folks to the museum flood area webpage on the county's website. There's good information there in terms of projects that have been completed. And then as we move forward into implementation of the NRCS EWP funded project, as well as the on-forest sediment reduction project, there'll be forthcoming information on that in terms of information available within our website.
That's a good point. I'll put the flood area website in the chat for folks who have not been to the site before. And then Sat, you wanted to ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. When I go out to my friend's house in Baderville and I look out their north window, or I guess it's maybe facing more east and north, and I see the entire span of the peaks there, leading up to all the peaks in the Snow Bowl. And I think the spring that starts the Rio de Flag is up there. And I just think if that went, it would, number one, aim a huge flood at downtown Flagstaff, take out Baderville, and just take the heart out of the city as far as what we think of Flagstaff as being. And I compare it to what's happened on the east side of Mount Eldon, which is pretty much toast. But I don't hear that as a project. I hear Bill Williams Mountain, I hear Kachina and other areas. I wonder where that is on the priority list, because to me, that would be the first priority. Thanks.
I think Paul and Jay will try and answer.
Yeah, hi, Sat. I can speak to it a little bit, and then I'll let Jay talk about the county lands out there. But first, great question, and great what we would call situational awareness, right? So when you're looking at that area and you're realizing that, I think that's step one to building awareness at the community level, and then bringing that to our attention on webinars and forums like this. But first I'll offer you an example of a really good success story in and around that area. 2 summers ago, we had a fire at the junction of Snowball Road and the 164B, as in Bravo Road. And again, multi-agency kind of jurisdictional lines all intersect there. And between, I think, the Forest Service, Flag Fire, Summit Fire, and the state, we had 4 responding agencies to a 5-acre fire. Red Flag Day in June, sustained 40-mile-an-hour winds out of the southwest, lining right up with that area that you were talking about. So our biggest concern was where Snowball Road begins to bend back to the east on that first hairpin turn. If it crossed there, there were no other features to pick it up until either the Snowball infrastructure or the top of the peaks. But what ended up happening was that fire ran into 2 different landscape treatment areas that had been hand thinned in the past. Dropped down to ground level, and then gave initial attack resources the opportunity to strategically manage that fire and fully suppress it at 5 acres. So those types of opportunities are what we're looking for, and that's what we're looking to create. Now, as far as bigger picture, large landscape stuff, I think everything's within a plan. FWPP footprint is pretty large, but we're talking about 100 years of policies and full suppression efforts to kind of make up for. And with that, I'll let Jay jump in and talk more about that specific piece of ground.
Sure. As Paul said, your instincts are right on. That was in our FEMA study that we did in 2017, identified as one of the top watersheds that needed to be protected for the post-fire flood threat. And the county chose Bill Williams Mountain because, you know, the city was already working on FWPP and in the Dry Lake Hills area. But as we have now gotten to the point where we're finishing up some of the funding for Bill Williams Mountain, we are focusing on the Upper Rio watershed, especially that western slope of the peaks, as our next highest priority. So I'll be going to the board tomorrow to talk to our board as far as recommending funding levels for the Upper Rio. We're working with the Forest Service, National Forest Foundation, City of Flagstaff, Department of Forestry and Fire Management. We're all interested in this area. The Forest Service has a timber sale going that they're putting together right now called LaRue that goes kind of along that northwestern side of Snowball Road. The Forest Service is also looking at some hand thinning areas along Snowball Road because of that. As you jump into those steep slopes there, you know, one thing that we're going to have to worry about and look at is when you reach that boundary line for the wilderness, what do we do? You know, and it's not just more the density of the trees, it's the amount of dead and down wood that's on the forest floor. You know, some places there it's 6 feet deep. So if we thinned all the forest and left that, you know, we're still going to be in a high fire danger and post-fire risk for flooding. So, you know, we're going to have to try to figure out how do we handle working in some of these maybe wilderness areas as well. But in the meantime, we want to thin those steep slopes leading up to those wilderness areas. And that is on our radar. It is the next highest priority for us as we finish up Bill Williams Mountain.
I think that's a really good point, Jay. And, you know, two things about that watershed. First, there is a watershed alliance for the Rio de Flag that has just completed a 2-year study with the Bureau of Reclamation funding that included the city and the county and others to build a draft watershed plan for the Rio de Flag. And that includes things in the upper reaches, like we're talking about now, all the way down to the urbanized areas and the lower reaches where it joins up to the Little Colorado. I put the website for that in the chat as well for folks who aren't familiar with it. The project was pulled together by the Friends of the Rio de Flag, and they received the grant to do this work. Because the watershed conditions are not the same from both a fuels perspective or from a water perspective from one area to the next. You know, Jay was talking a little bit about the spruce fir ecosystem and the alpine ecosystem that we find at the top of Snowball. And it's important to recognize that those are systems that have stand replacing fire as their historical disturbance regime. And that doesn't mean there was always stand replacing fires, but it means it was not outside the normal range of variation for a spruce fir ecosystem to have a stand replacing fire. And those are exactly the kind of hazards that once people are introduced into the landscape that we're paying special attention to, because now humans are part of the system here. We are seeing those impacts on communities and on houses in those areas. So that's part of our situational awareness too, is we both have the historical variability on the landscape, like Paul gave us some great images to describe. Sometimes we're outside of that range, sometimes we're in it, but that doesn't mean there aren't hazards, even if what we are seeing on the landscape falls within that historical range of variability. And that's part of the importance of understanding the mitigation and planning and preparedness going forward. We are over time, but I'm going to let Mark ask a question and then I will stop recording and we can continue the conversation if people can stay a little bit. Mark.
This is just to help me out because there's a lot of confusion between heritage resource protection and resource protection, and understanding the level of safety of trees adjacent to properties. I get that question. What is the risk there?
Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about fuels reduction in the wildland urban interface and around properties and buildings?
Yeah, you bet, Sarah. Thank you. And Mark, let me ask a follow-up question. You said you received that question a lot. So can you kind of help provide a framework for that a little bit? That might help me with an answer.
Yeah, I'm the Heritage Preservation Officer for Flagstaff. And of course, that's historic buildings and, you know, our history. People will ask me about, well, you know, they're talking planning a project and they go, well, this tree is in the way. And sometimes even the trees are considered historic landscaping. So that level of safety by leaving a concentration of trees within an urban area, I think you kind of covered that with those graphics, I believe.
Yeah, and Mark, I think that's a great question. It's one that we can certainly follow up with a little bit. I don't want to say offline, but continue the conversation away from the webinar. We have a Firewise coordination office within Wildland Fire Management that specializes in that specific topic. And so, without you know, seeing an image, I'm sure I'm picturing what you're talking about. But I think actually coming out and following up with you on site and seeing those types of trees would be really important. But what I will say about something like that is, you know, our typical rule of thumb is 1.5 tree lengths away from any sort of a structure. That, you know, if there's any sort of reason to believe that tree is experiencing mortality, or if it could be impacted by wildland fire, if it's in a really dense area, things like that, those are certain factors we'll take into account when deciding whether or not that kind of a tree needs to come down. But again, you know, my email's in the chat. Please follow up with me and I'll make sure to make an introduction with our Firewise coordinator and follow up with you.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make, Paul, is that there are resources at both the city and the county. If you think that a tree on your property poses a hazard, either because it's got limbs that are coming in under your roof eaves, or because it's starting to show decay or root rise, or any of those things that a forester would tell you, you know, a good place to start if you have those kinds of questions as a property owner is always your local fire department, because they have the ability to help assess hazard trees for the most part, and they have the training, and they can help you make those decisions on a property in a way that's really, really useful. I will remind anybody, if you're cutting a tree on a property in the city of Flagstaff and it's in a place that we call the resource protection overlay, you may have to come in and get it approved. So, and that's because there were a certain number of trees left on in your neighborhood as part of a development when it was first developed. And so the city kind of has to track to make sure that we're not taking out trees that need to be part of that original development agreement. But what we do want to do is always kind of move us towards an environment that is aware of and managing fire when we're building new parts of the community and when we are infilling parts of the community, so that their risk of floods and the risk of fire is something that's part of the story that we consider and part of our decision making. So with that, I'm going to stop recording.